Hey, good morning, guys. No video this week because we got a whole bunch new allergies going on this week. And it's pretty easy to eliminate my snorting and sniffing and coughing from an audio, but oh man, when I've got to do it in a video, it's just so hard. And you know what's really bad is like having to scratch my nose, and I don't want you guys to see. I don't want you to see me scratching my nose all the time because it can get kind of gross. Anyway, today I'm going to teach you guys something that's really important to me. And that's about the ancient Near East. And I don't know if I've even used that term with you before, but I'm going to teach you about what the ancient Near East is and why it matters. But as we go along, you're going to go, oh, she's been teaching us about the ancient Near East all this time. She just hasn't called it that. And I share this with you guys because I don't think of you guys as my students or anything. I think of you guys as my friends. And this is something I love, and this is something that's really important to me. Otherwise, I wouldn't be teaching you the Bible for free, right? I mean, well, I guess I don't have anything better to do. But when I'm sharing with you guys, it's like I'm sharing with my friends, with my best friends, with people I would like to sit and talk with. This stuff's really important to me. And because it's important to me, I want to share it with you. I want you to know this stuff. And you know, I only started really studying this stuff about 10 years ago. So that means that in 10 years, you could be where I am. Well, not doing this, I hope, doing something else. We don't need any more of Miss Tyler. But yeah, no, all this stuff is so important to me, and I love it, and it helps me love the Bible, and it gives me a friendly relationship with my Bible. Instead of a relationship where I'm going like, I'm trying to make it do what I want it to do, and I'm just letting the Bible be what the Bible wants to be. And so I learn about it, and I learned about what was going on when it was written and the kind of things that the people who were writing it were thinking about. Anyway, so we're just going to get to this. And next week, the reason I'm doing this is because next week we're going to start with Genesis 21. And we're going to get into more and more and more and more context that we know from archaeology in the lives of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and his kids. But without that context, and yeah, that's what I teach you guys every week, right? I always teach you guys context almost. Without that context, we can make some really wrong decisions about what they're doing and what they're thinking. And we just really won't understand things the way we would like to. And it takes a long time to read through the Bible. And isn't it sad if you're reading through something that just doesn't make any sense? So I want you guys to love your Bibles and to love reading your Bibles and to look at it like a treasure hunt where you're finding these things. It's like, oh, I know what that means. Anyway, you guys are really, really smart. And because you're much younger than I am, you have better memories and a lot more time to learn things that I wish I'd known when I was your age. I just actually wish that I believed in God when I was your age, which I didn't. So anyway, let's go ahead and do this week's broadcast. Hi, I'm Miss Tyler, and welcome to this week's episode of Context for Kids, where I teach you guys stuff most adults don't even know. If this is your first time hearing, or if you've missed anything, you can find all the episodes archived at contextforkids.podbean.com, which has them downloadable, or at contextforkids.com, where I have transcripts for readers, or on my Context for Kids YouTube channel, where I post slightly longer versions. And this is episode 149. And I'm really excited for next week, episode 150, because Sarah is finally going to have a baby. I mean, after all this time. And I think 150 is kind of like a good number. Now, all scripture this week comes from the MTV, which is the Miss Tyler version, which is the Christian Standard Bible tweaked a little or a lot to make the context and the content more understandable to kids. So, hey there. We've talked about the ancient world a lot since we started in Genesis like almost 4 years ago. and how differently they lived and thought and believed than we do today. We've talked about what life in Babylon was like and about ziggurats, but now we're going to go a lot deeper as we continue with the story of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his 12 sons. When we looked at Genesis 1, we had a talk about ancient temple texts that archaeologists have found, with their stories of temples being built in 6 days and the God of the temple resting and ruling on the 7th day, and how God used that to explain to Moses that the universe is created to be his temple, and he rules over it with humans as his priests and kings. Then we learned about the flood. We talked about the Atrahasis epic and their flood story. And for the Tower of Babel, we studied ancient ziggurats, which the people believed were stairways to heaven that the gods would use for walking up and down. But starting with chapter 21, we'll be talking more and more about the law codes of the ancient world that Abraham and Sarah grew up with. Over the last 150 years, archaeologists have found clay tablets with the laws of ancient Sumeria, and that's the Code of Lipit Ishtar, Babylon, the Law of Hammurabi, which is very famous, and the Hittite and Middle Assyrian laws. We'll be talking about all of those as we go from Genesis through Deuteronomy. All of these nations with all of these laws, from the Egyptians, Canaanites, Babylonians, and Assyrians to the Hittites, who were messed up people, let me tell you, lived in an area along with Abraham and his descendants that we call the ancient Near East. In fact, all of the Hebrew Bible happens in the ancient Near East. Ancient means old, a long time ago, and even older than boomers, which I am not a boomer, all right? I am Gen X, just for your information. My kids like to call me boomers, and you know what I do when they call me that, even though they're 23 years old? I take the kitchen spoon to their behinds. Yeah, they may have fun calling me a boomer, but I have fun whacking their butts. Now, the Near East is part of the world covering everywhere from Turkey and Israel to Egypt in the south to Iraq and Iran in the east. We call it the Near East because that's the name it was given by people in Europe and America. It was nearer than the Far East, where we find countries like China, Japan, and India. All of the countries in the ancient Near East thought the same kinds of things about the world, about science, and about the gods. So it really shouldn't surprise us that they also had laws that were very much the same, plus some laws that make no sense to us today because we can't follow those laws while loving our neighbors as ourselves. Also, we don't have temples and animal sacrifices anymore, so any of the laws about those, we just kind of have to push to the side and say, okay, I'm not doing that. You know, a lot of stuff that happens in the Bible, people just had no clue why they did what they did until they found all these old law codes. Why did Sarah give Hagar to Abraham to have a baby, and why on earth would that baby belong to Sarah instead of his mom Hagar? Oh, we've talked about that one, so you know the answer to that. Why will Sarah think it's okay to send Hagar and Ishmael away with nothing? Why did Laban trick Jacob into marrying Leah instead of Rachel? Why did God wait until there was a new Pharaoh before rescuing his people from slavery? Why are some of the laws that God gave to Moses the very same as the ones we find in other nations, and why are many of them very different? And what do these differences tell us about how trustworthy and good God is? Now, I have to tell you that when all these laws were originally found, some folks were like freaking out because so many of the laws were the same, and some of those laws were written down long before God spoke to Moses at Mount Sinai. But everyone needs rules, right? And most cultures on earth think that murder is a bad idea, and wife stealing, like we talked about in chapter 20, and they needed laws about slavery, war, being married, and festivals, and all that stuff. When Sarah and Abraham were born, it was in Babylon. And so those were the laws their family was raised with. God never told Abraham a single thing until he was like 75 years old. And then God just said, "Follow me," more or less. And later God will say that Abraham was faithful about doing everything God told him to do. Now we know that Abraham did a lot of stuff wrong, but he must have been really good about the changes God made to the way Abraham understood about what was right and wrong. Wouldn't it have been just awful if God had changed everything right away? You know, God is always really patient with us and doesn't change everything right away because we have to get used to living in new ways a little bit at a time. In the commandments that God gave to Moses, we even see God saying that the children of Israel aren't allowed to do some of the nonsense that Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and his sons did. We don't know what's wrong until people tell us, and they didn't know everything that made God unhappy. I mean, after all, Jesus took God's commandments and made them way more strict. We can't do some of the stuff that Moses and the Israelites could get away with because now we have the Holy Spirit, and so we can grow to be more loving, forgiving, kind, and self-controlled, and so now that's what God expects of us. Without the Spirit and living in that world, they couldn't live the way we're called to live by Jesus. It would be impossible. So we see a lot of them following a lot of the laws from the nations around them. Some of those laws were good and other laws were bad. Now today in my own country, some of our laws are good, but other laws are really bad. One of my absolute favorite Bible teachers, John Walton, says that all of these laws and the way they lived and thought and believed was so normal for them that it was like the water that everyone was drinking or swimming in. I want you to imagine your country, or maybe your town, like a swimming pool or pond. The pool is full of your shared experiences, how y'all dress and eat, and the music you hear, and whether you live in a desert or a forest or a city. Depending on where you live, you might have a car, or take the bus, or travel by subway or train. And so does everyone around you. You don't need car laws if everyone's taken the bus. And those bus laws will be the same for you and everyone else, no matter what God you worship or what you look like. Hopefully. Or, at least they should be the same, right? You are in the bus with all sorts of people and you are all wearing clothes because that's what we do, thank goodness. And drinking coffee or soda or tea and talking on the phone or playing a game or reading a book or maybe just thinking or listening to music. Those things are all different, but they're also all normal. I hate coffee, but it would be normal for me to see someone else drinking it. It wouldn't be weird. The ancient world wasn't much different in that they also had things that everyone was used to, like donkeys and camels and sheep and cows and even having them in the house. When they ate, it was usually lentils, which is like kind of a bean, and fresh baked bread that was a lot like tortillas, which they dipped in oil or vinegar. And they drank water and wine, and sometimes beer if the water wasn't clean. Every once in a while, they might even get some meat. Men and women both wore long dresses and no underwear. Usually, you can see the Egyptians didn't because it was too hot down there, I think. They lived in tents if they had critters, and in or around cities if they were craftsmen. So all these people, just like us, would need to have rules based on their environment. They didn't need rules about cars and buses. They needed rules about what happens when a guy's ox or bull killed somebody. Of course, as we'll see, their rules weren't exactly like God's in one important way. They had laws that said that the rich and powerful people and men were more important than poor and vulnerable people and women and children and foreigners. Now, if you accidentally killed a slave, you had to pay the owner, but that was it. If you accidentally killed someone rich, you were going to die if you were lucky. God said that everyone is made in his image, and so every single one is precious and worth exactly the same amount. So I want you to think you are worth exactly as much as a bazillionaire or someone or Simone Biles, who is the greatest gymnast who ever lived, or a famous singer, okay? You are worth absolutely every bit as much as they are. But in the pagan nations, they wouldn't have thought that. Unfortunately, there are many times after God gave his commandments when the kings and other powerful people would obey the laws of other nations instead, and they would play favorites, and that made God very angry. You know, King David did a really good job of following God before he became king, but the longer he was king, the more he became like the kings of the other nations. And the kings of the other nations could do whatever they wanted because the laws were for the people and not for the kings. And that's not good at all. Not good. But normal for them. It was all part of that water I was telling you about, the water that everyone was drinking or swimming in, however you want to look at it. But why did it look like that if these were laws? Well, this is where it gets a bit confusing because the ancient world didn't exactly have laws the way we do or the way they did in Jesus' time. What ancient people had were judges and wisdom. Their judges were chosen from the people because hopefully they were smart and honest. At least that's the kind of judges that God wanted for his people. I imagine the judges in most communities in the ancient world were more along the lines of being rich and powerful older guys. What sort of judge you had was connected to what sort of wisdom was going to be used to decide what was right and wrong and good and bad. God's laws said that rich and poor, old and young, powerful or weak, were to be treated exactly the same by the judges, because they were all made in God's image, no exceptions. But in other nations, their gods played favorites, and so did the judges. And their wisdom told them that that's what was right, that rich people were more like the gods than poor people, and free people were worth more than slaves. That was wisdom to them because it just made sense. They looked at the world and thought that the world of the gods was the same. But God's wisdom was different, and so were his instructions, which is really a better word than law or commandments because they weren't like the laws that we have today, although some were. When a judge has a law that says stealing such and such is wrong and you have to go to jail for a year, then that's what they need to do no matter what was stolen. But with wisdom and instructions, judges can make decisions that are better. Stealing is still wrong, but what God told Moses let them make decisions about how they were going to handle different situations. It gave them a starting point for making decisions. That's why all through the Bible, we see people doing things that the Bible says are wrong, and some really get punished. Some even die. And others, not so much. One of the rules given to Moses said that no Moabite could be part of God's people for up to 10 generations, which pretty much meant forever. But God chose the grandson of a Moabite woman, Ruth, to be the king of his people. He chose him. God could overlook his own rules because he saw something in David that he liked. If they had been laws like our laws, then the rest of Israel never would have accepted David as their king and probably just would have killed him. That's the difference between wisdom and laws. Wise judges use God's instructions to help them decide what is good in a situation. Foolish judges just judge people without thinking about what's right. Jesus got into trouble for this quite a bit because he would do things on the Sabbath that weren't evil, but weren't exactly okay if the instructions that God gave to Moses weren't meant to be thought about very carefully. Jesus healed people on the Sabbath, but when the Pharisees got angry about it because they had turned God's instructions into actual laws that were very strict and weren't always wise or kind, Jesus had to remind them about the reason for the Sabbath, that people could rest and be at peace. If someone needed healing, that means they weren't having a very restful Sabbath, and that wasn't right. Another time, Jesus and his disciples were picking grain in the fields because they were hungry, and again, the Pharisees got angry at them because they were quote-unquote working. They had decided that harvesting crops is working, and they're right about that, because that's really hard work. But Jesus and his disciples were just picking a bit of grain because they were hungry. Anyone who's hungry on the Sabbath isn't really resting, right? And Jesus told a story about the time that David and the high priest had broken one of the serious temple laws. The high priest gave the bread that belonged to God to David and his men to eat because God gave Moses his wisdom about what it looked like to be more good than the world around them. It also gave them the freedom to make wise decisions and to make exceptions that were going to save lives and make lives better for the glory of God. These people knew that God wanted them to work 6 days a week, rest on the seventh day, and to have full bellies. Anything they would do to get in the way of that wouldn't really be obeying God. As I said before, God's wisdom is very different from the wisdom of the nations around them that was totally unfair and even cruel to the people who needed the most help. Now, another thing about the ancient Near East, everyone believed there were a lot of gods, and that every nation had their own gods who were only actually powerful in their own nation. There's a really funny story in the Bible about some folks who attacked the Israelites in the mountains, and when they got their butts kicked, they decided that the God of Israel must be a god of the mountains, so powerful in the mountains. And so they decided to attack the Israelites in the valley the next time. Well, we know that our God is powerful everywhere, so that really didn't go well for them. But the ancient Israelites, up until the end of the Old Testament, totally believed that there were a lot of other gods, and even worshiped some of them because they believed those gods had power over something that they wanted or needed. They did that not because they didn't believe that the God of, Abraham wasn't the strongest and biggest and best, but because they really believed that there were other gods out there with real powers. Everyone did. It was that water they were drinking. That's what made sense. It seemed silly to them that there could be only one God. Who would take care of the rest of the earth and all the stuff that needed to be done? It wasn't until much later, a few hundred years before Jesus, that the Jewish people realized that there really was only one God. And the rest of the world thought they were really weird for thinking that. When Jesus came, they were still living in the Near East, but it wasn't ancient anymore. By then, they were living in what we call Greco-Roman times, the 1st century. And they didn't think like ancient Egyptians and Canaanites and Babylonians and Persians anymore, but more like Greeks, who had come from the West and had very different values and ideas. Some good, some bad. They looked at the world very differently than the people in the Old Testament. And they did different things with the Bible in the centuries right before Jesus was born than they ever had before. For one thing, they started writing what-if stories about the Bible. We read some of the ones about Nimrod, which were really funny, right? And they also began to interpret the Bible using philosophy, which was a way of thinking about how to live the right kind of life. And the Greeks were obsessed with philosophy. Now, just like it had been in ancient times, when the Israelites were forever being tempted to worship other gods and, to do the wicked things that the Canaanites were doing, they were also challenged during Greco-Roman times. No one was actually tempted to worship other gods anymore, but instead of one religion, Judaism became many religions as people began to think in different ways and had different feelings about the Greek world around them, as well as different ideas about how the commandments should be kept. Because there aren't a lot of details in the Bible. It just kind of says something and it's like, well, I would like an explanation, but they don't give one. That's why it's wisdom and not because laws are really specific. Now, some Jews were very religious and some just wanted to be like the Greek pagans because of the differences, there were even wars among the Jews. It was a terrible mess for quite a long time. For the first time, young Jewish boys in the cities and bigger towns were going to Bible school to learn the Torah and the prophets and the writings. And that's just a fancy way of saying the Old Testament, which was their whole Bible, and Jesus' whole Bible too. During Old Testament times in the ancient Near East, they didn't have the Bible because it was still being written. It was being written about them. By the time of Jesus, it was all done, and they had everything that we still have today. That Bible left them with a lot of questions and a lot of theories about what was going to happen in the future. Some people thought they saw a resurrection in the Bible, where all the people who had loved God would come to life and live with him forever here on earth. Some people didn't. And so they didn't believe there was any reason to be good people because they thought they would all just die, and that was that. Others hated everything Greek so much that they went into the desert and lived by themselves and really had nothing good to say about the Jews living in the cities or any of the Jews not living with them. And then there were some who believed that God wanted them to be violent and kick the Romans out of Judah and Galilee where they were living. Many looked at what the Bible had said about all of the promises made to David and believed there would be a Messiah, which means anointed one, and that's someone chosen by God for a special job. But the different groups had different ideas about the Messiah and what he would look like. Some Bible verses made it look like he would be a priest, and others as a warrior doing battle. And then some seemed to say he would be tortured, rejected, and killed. Well, that was sure confusing. How could the Messiah be all of these things at the same time? It seemed impossible. Jews took sides against one another and split into factions, which are groups of people who join together because of something they do or don't agree with. Like political parties where sometimes people don't even want to be friends with people who don't vote the same way. This was very different than life was in the ancient Near Eastern world of the Old Testament. People in communities pretty much did what was expected of them. And people left the worship of a god to the priests. And, there was only one way to worship each god. There was only one set of beliefs, and they didn't mess with that because they were scared of what would happen if they made their gods angry. So they did everything the same way year after year. They farmed the same way, lived the same way, and worshipped the same way. They told the same stories and sang the same songs and grew the same crops. They knew it had always worked, and they figured it would always work. It wasn't like today when we get new inventions and new discoveries every other minute, and it doesn't even bother us. We like it. The people of the Old Testament were just trying to have enough to eat and to try, not to get beaten up by foreign armies. But by the time of Jesus, life had been very different for a long time. After the Babylonians destroyed the temple and the walls of Jerusalem, they forced everyone who wasn't extremely poor to move east to Babylon, like a 3-month walk. and they had to learn different ways of life. And then the Medes and the Persians sacked Babylon and took over, and they did things kind of differently too. And then finally the Greeks came in and took over, but the Greeks changed things more than anyone. The Greeks wanted everyone to be just like them, and so wherever they went, they built theaters and gymnasiums where dudes played sports totally naked, which actually sounds dangerous to me. Now, pretty soon, everyone was living like Greeks and learning about the Greeks' ways of doing science. The Greeks wanted to talk about everything and explore everything and to learn new ways of thinking about life and about the gods. That was a very new way of living. Many Greek ways of doing things were very useful, but others, not so much. For the first time ever, people were looking to the future more than they were looking back at the past. They wanted to know what was going to happen, and they wanted to come up with better ways of doing things, and they weren't as worried about getting the gods angry at them for changing the way they were doing things. But that only went so far because the faithful Jews were very worried about the Greek ways of doing things and the way they lived. So the Jewish people decided that their Bible was just about the most important thing in the world, along with God and the temple. They believed it would protect them from becoming too much like the Greeks, and then the Romans, who were in control when Jesus was born. You see, when the Greeks were in charge, there was a terrible war that started with some very bad decisions made by some Jews who wanted to ditch the Bible and become totally Greek. That led to a horrible persecution where people were killed for obeying God's commandments. Of course, that made the Bible even more important to the Jews who loved God. But after the war, it also led to the instructions of God being made into very strict laws. Sometimes. And at other times, they looked for ways to do bad things if the Bible didn't specifically say it was wrong. So Jesus was born into a very different Greco-Roman world that was much different from the world that Abraham knew, which was also very different from David's world. So we can't read the stories like they're all the same because they're actually very different. I love you. I'm praying for you. I hope you will stick with me as we learn about all the different times in the Bible and how people's lives could be very different depending on when and where they were born.